Hello, I'm Dr. David R. Lewis, Chief Client Officer at BEworks, a behavioral economics consulting firm. Today we're going to talk about behavioral economics and the insights that can help us understand why people are behaving they are during periods of crisis, during market volatility, for example. Behavioral economics is the scientific study of human behavior and offers powerful new ways to understand consumer behavior. Traditional economic theory states that we are rational, utility-maximizing consumers, that we seek and have all available information, that we calculate the costs and benefits of every decision, and then we make rational choices based on that information. The problem with traditional economics is it doesn't really reflect reality. In fact, we intend to be rational, but there are so many heuristics and biases that are so consistent that it's been described as predictably irrational. So we're constrained by time, mental energy, and that prevents us from fully evaluating every decision. So we do what Simon referred to as satisficing, do the best that we can, given the limitations. Later studies by Kahneman and Tversky in 1974, for example, they started talking about heuristics that are mental shortcuts that we use when making decisions. And there's also many biases, and a bias is really just the description of when our decision-making isn't necessarily aligned with the direction that it should be, that it's tilted in some way, and so it's biased. And the culmination of a lot of this research has come about with Dan Ariely, for example, describing our behavior as predictably irrational. Similarly, Thaler talked about irrationality, and it's been studied so much that we can actually predict how and why people are going to be irrational. So if you look at the way rational choice theory of traditional economics versus behavioral economics considers decision-making, right? Rational choice theory, again, says we seek all information, calculate costs and benefits, and make rational choices. But there's also the other side. So there's two sides to the brain. And Kahneman, for example, referred to it as system 1 and system 2. So our rational side is dispassionate, pursues self-interest, is unbiased in judgments and decision-making, and can effortlessly implement rational decisions. But the other side is that we're more emotional than rational sometimes. So we have ill-defined desires and preferences. Our judgments are actually influenced by those emotions, and as a result, we're subject to self-control problems. We don't always do what we know we should do. So the traditional view is economic man, or homo economicus, and the emergent view is homo psychologicus, that basically says we're a psychological being, we're not computers. You put them together, and that actually does a better job of explaining how and why people behave the way they do. So, as an example, we like to try and make sense of the world. And many times it's more the non-rational side versus the rational side that tries to make sense of the world. So, as an example, clustering illusion refers to one particular heuristic whereby people make patterns out of things that aren't really a pattern. So you can see a rabbit out of a cloud. Rationally, we know that it's a cloud, but irrationally, we think it looks like a rabbit. Similarly, if you look at data, so the chart on the right is an interesting stat. It actually shows the high correlation between the divorce rate in the state of Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine. So that's a mathematical relationship that's a very high correlation. And the higher the correlation, the more likely it is that we'll conclude that there's some causation there. A correlation above 70, people would say, oh, something's probably going on there because that correlation explains 70% of the variance. But the reality is we know there really can't be a connection between the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine. You could run experiments to determine, but that would be somewhat unethical. You'd have to either force people to eat margarine and see if they get divorced, or force people to get divorced and see if they can eat more margarine, neither of which is really ethical. But the point of this really is that many times our irrational side sees patterns in information when it really doesn't exist. It's really just random. So what about financial decision making? The question there, of course, is surely when we're making financial decisions and thinking about our money, that we would be fully rational rather than emotional and subject to heuristics and biases. So here's an interesting story. This looks at millennials who inherit money. And what the story shows basically is that most millennials who anticipate receiving money feel very confident in their ability to manage their inheritance. But nearly half, or 46% of those who have already inherited money, have learned that they actually aren't as capable of making those decisions. And in retrospect, they wish that they had sought professional advice on how to manage their inheritance. So let's think about that decision to seek advice, right? So the traditional economic view would be that we would recognize the value of professional advice, because investment decision making, it's a difficult decision, it's a risky decision. We may not know exactly what we want. We may not actually feel like we're in a position to identify all of the various options. And we may be afraid of making a decision for which we're less satisfied. All of those seems like, perfectly reasonable, rational explanations for why people would want to seek advice, as well as perhaps why they wouldn't. So if you don't perceive it as being difficult, you don't see that there's a lot of risk, you're able to take control yourself, you're easily able to identify all of the various preferences, and you're satisfied with your past decision making, then that should predict that you won't seek advice. And similarly, if you think the decision is difficult, risky, it's difficult to make decisions, difficult to identify preferences, and you've often felt dissatisfied, that should explain why you don't seek advice. So that would be the rational, traditional view of analyzing the advice decision. Now, behavioral economics takes the view that, we are not always rational. We're intendedly rational. So many times, these heuristics and biases can affect decision making. So an interesting measure is objective knowledge. That is how much you actually know about a topic. Subjective knowledge is how much you think you know about a topic. And confidence is your belief in your ability to perform well or make a good decision. So those are more behavioral types of ways of looking at why people would or would not seek advice. And so one interesting thing we find actually is that what really matters is the difference between what you know and what you think you know. So the Dunning-Kruger effect has found that people with lower levels of expertise have a tendency to overestimate their capabilities when they're making complex decisions. So financial literacy is a good objective measure of how much you know, and self-reported expertise is the subjective measure, or how much you think you know. And overconfidence results when we think we know more than we actually do. So this data comes out of a study that I did in 2018, and it divides people into one of four boxes, essentially. So subjective novices believe they don't know very much, and subjective experts believe that they know a great deal. Objective experts, that's the objective measure, what you actually know. You have people who tend to know a great deal or do know a great deal and perform well on tests of financial knowledge and financial literacy. So they're the objective experts. Then you also have the objective novices. Those are the people who actually don't do well at all, and it turns out they really don't know very much about investing, for example. And you can see there's four possible quadrants here. The dangerous one is people who think they're experts, the subjective experts, but they're objective novices. They score poorly on tests of financial literacy and investment knowledge. So they're the dangerous ones. They think they know more than they actually do. You've also got, in the green boxes, objective novices and subjective novices. Those are people who don't think they know very much. And in fact, the test shows they don't know very much. Subjective experts, who are objective experts, those are people who think they know a great deal about financial decision making, and it turns out they actually do. So if we're thinking about why people do or don't seek advice, we have all those rational measures. Preference identification. Were you able to identify for example, which mutual fund you would like by picking them out of a large list of mutual funds and understanding the characteristics? How satisfied are you with the decision that you made? How difficult was that decision? Did you feel like you had a level of self-determination, the ability to actually make your own decision and be comfortable with it? Then there's risk appetite. Did you think that this was a risky decision? Finally, we looked at objective expertise, what do they actually know, and subjective expertise, which is what do they think they know. And of all of these factors, so the traditional factors, which rational choice theory and traditional economics would say that, of course, preference identification and satisfaction and difficulty and self-determination and risk are going to determine whether people seek advice. In fact, the only thing that was predictive of whether people seek financial advice was their level of confidence or overconfident. And in fact, the more confident people were, for every unit increase in confidence on a scale, they became twice as likely to not seek advice. So, at a unit level of 1, it would be, say, 2. At a unit level of 2, so if they're scoring 2 on a confidence, they're 4 times less likely to seek advice. With a 3, they're 8 times less likely. So you can see that confidence really starts to prevent people from seeking advice. And this is a bias. This is something that's causing people to make decisions which are not necessarily normatively optimal decisions. And that overconfidence is a bias. And studying overconfidence is an example of how behavioral economics brings perspectives and insights to decision making that the traditional, more rational view of having ways to explain behavior, it really complements it. And in this case, it shows, in fact, that all of those rational factors do not, in fact, predict the decision to seek advice. And you can see that in the column under significance. So a significance level typically is less than 0.05. So you can see, as an example, ability to identify preferences had a significance of 0.99. That is about as far from being significant as you can get. So what it shows is it really has no effect whatsoever. And this is an interesting demonstration that a lot of what we assume are the rational factors behind a decision, in fact, really don't explain people's decisions. So behavioral economics offers insights on why people are making these apparently irrational decisions. When we make decisions, we try to be rational, but we're constrained by time, mental energy, and limited willpower. So we take shortcuts, and these shortcuts are called heuristics. But those heuristics leave us vulnerable to biases. So let me give you some examples, specifically in the investment context. One is loss aversion. So we feel the pain of losing 2.5 times more than the joy of an equal gain. So what that says is, if you were to win $10 versus lose $10, you're not equally happy and unhappy. In fact, you're twice as unhappy losing as you would be happy winning. And happiness isn't necessarily that something that goes on a scale from -10 to +10. But what it says is people's emotional reaction to loss is twice as large as their emotional reaction to gain. So what that makes them do oftentimes is so for example, when investing, people take less risk than they need to. And if you don't take enough risk in your portfolio, in the long run, you won't actually be able to have the performance that you need. You won't reach your financial goals. So that, loss aversion is why people stick money in a savings account. Loss aversion would also be why people are selling during periods of market volatility. Everyone knows that when markets go down, they come back up again. But the loss averse people just can't bear the prospect of it continuing to go down. So they sell, and then they miss the recovery. Another bias is called anchoring. So, for example, we become anchored on an irrelevant piece of information. And if you could think about, say, buying a stock or buying a mutual fund, you bought it at $10 and it goes down to $5 and it really has no prospect for going up at all from there. Well, people will be hesitant to sell it because they're anchored on that $10 figure. They're saying, well, I paid $10 for this, so that's what it's worth. So I'm not going to sell it until I get the $10 back. That's also another aspect called escalating commitment. But the fact that they're anchored on that $10 and it's an irrelevant fact. The better way to look at that is, okay, this stock is currently $5. Would you buy it at $5? Because if not, then you should sell it, because $5 is the price that matters, not the $10. Another bias is confirmation bias. So we have a tendency to look for and interpret information that confirms our prior beliefs and attitudes. That can explain, for example, a preference for news outlets, right? People like hearing confirmation of their beliefs. They don't like hearing things that contradict their beliefs. So people tend to watch one station because that station confirms their beliefs. But you can see how that can leave them missing information. You're not able to get the full picture if you're just focusing on things that confirm what you thought all along. And in volatile market times, you can see how that could become people looking for information that tells them that the market's going to keep going down because they're loss averse and they're anchored on where the market was. And so they interpret all information in a way that confirms that view. In reality, what they should be doing is looking at both sides of it. They should be actively looking for information that disconfirms what they believe. And that way they can have a more balanced view and a more balanced perspective. There's also a bias called hyperbolic discounting. People tend to prefer an immediate small reward over a larger reward later in time. And it's funny, this is even tested in young children. There's a famous experiment called the Marshmallow Experiment where you seat a child down at a table and give them a marshmallow and say to them, if you can avoid eating this marshmallow and come back in 10 minutes, I'll give you a second marshmallow. Well, a large number of the kids would rather have, one marshmallow now than 2 marshmallows in a month. And in fact, you find that with people making financial decisions. So you say to people, would you rather have, $10 now or $10 in a year? And people are always going to say, well, I'd rather have $10 now. So if you look, for example, you give them a choice, then you can say, okay, you can have $100 now or $110 in a week. People will pick the $100 now. If you tell them in a year's time you can have $100, or in a year and a week you can have $110, then they'll actually choose $110. So they're willing to forego it in the future because it's psychologically distant and doesn't mean that much, but they're not willing to forego it in the short term. So you can see how that can affect decision-making with respect to investing for the long run. And finally, as we showed in that previous study, we all tend to overestimate our ability to make decisions. There's many studies done on this. Some of them are very humorous. Like 75% of the people think they're above average drivers. I've even heard, that's as high as 90% in some studies. Well, we know that's mathematically not possible. So this overconfidence leads people to make bad decisions. This is just an example of 5, a small number of heuristics and biases that can actually help us explain and understand why people are reacting to market conditions the way they're reacting. Most important thing is that, the rational descriptions of why they're making those decisions really are not capable of giving the full picture. You really do need to understand the heuristics and biases. And that's the study of behavioral economics. Over thousands and thousands of studies, people have analyzed all of the ways in which we can make irrational decisions due to the presence of these biases. So that brings the presentation to a conclusion. I'm now available for questions.